Right, good evening everyone. Gentlemen, welcome back at Delphi. Today we're very privileged to have two strategic intellectuals, Professor Athanasios Platias, one of our finest strategists in Greece and president of the Council of International Relations, and historian Andrew Novo, a friend of Greece and professor at the National Defense University in the United States. So 2,500 years ago, Thucydides confidently declared that he did not write the history of the Peloponnesian War in order to capture the applause of the moment, but rather as a possession for all times, ectima esai. And here we are today, 2,500 years after that, with senior political leaders for both sides of the Pacific Ocean referring directly to Thucydides in order to understand China-US relations. We have President Xi Jinping, who has mentioned Thucydides, the Chinese president. We have the former US President, Barack Obama. We have senior advisors for the Trump administration that have referred to Thucydides. And I believe that most people in this room are aware of the concept of the Thucydides trap, right, by Graham Allison, which is the idea that a rising power, through the fear that instills in the ruling power, makes war inevitable. But if you really read Thucydides, this is a superficial argument. In fact, the Athenian historian provides a much more comprehensive strategic framework to understand hegemonic transition. And I believe the most important concept has to do with theories of victory. And according to Thucydides, Sparta had a theory of victory based on annihilation, a decisive battle to crush the adversary and prevail. And Athens had a theory of victory based on attrition, prolonged, protracted competition to tear the adversary over time. Now, if you take that concept, that framework, and try to evaluate the current relations between China and the United States, it's self-evident that annihilation is out of the question because these are two thermonuclear superpowers, and a kinetic hot war between two thermonuclear powers is suicidal. Neither side can win that war. We're living in conditions of mutual assured destruction. It's a mad world. But even within mad world, the attritional dimension of great power competition is there. And so what we're seeing today is not kinetic wars, it's wars by other means. We have a trade war, we have a technology war with restrictions, embargoes, and sanctions. We have proxy wars. And so, gentlemen, my first question, in this environment of prolonged, protracted competition, how do you think leaders can make sure that the attritional spectrum would be on the nuanced side of strategy, not on the hyper-provocative side of strategy? So attrition it is, but is there a way to make sure that that kind of attrition between China and the United States would be more nuanced and will allow space for cooperation? So how do you think Thucydides would advise Chinese and American leaders about attritional competition?
Well, Thucydides' work is characterized by complexity. His analysis works at three levels. He starts, of course, at the level of the system, looking at competing powers and the interest of these competing parties. But unlike the typical international relations scholars like Allison, that they stay there, he also zooms in the domestic system. The Athenian direct democracy versus the oligarchic system of Sparta. And these different systems produce different leaders. And leaders are extremely important in his analysis, not only because he can make a difference between victory and defeat, but also they generate power. Let's take two examples, or one example from Thucydides and bring one in the Chinese case, Themistocles and Deng Xiaoping. Themistocles took Athens, that was an agricultural state in Attica, and through a massive naval program and the ecosystem that he built around the naval program, he transformed Athens from an agricultural state to a sea power state, and actually it used this navy to defeat the Persians, but also create the empire and actually create the golden era of Athens in the 15th century. So that's creation of power and shaping the events. And since you asked me about the Chinese analogy, it takes Deng Xiaoping. He comes after Mao. The system is completely destroyed. The Chinese are ready for a war. They are developed. They have gone through famine. And suddenly, he changes the course of the Chinese ship of the state. And China now has grown into a superpower by economic reforms that he has made. So the leaders can make a difference, and therefore all the structural analysis, like the Thucydides trap that you have suggested, if you concentrate only at the level of the system and you lose the other two dimensions, you can be wrong. And if there is one lesson that Thucydides wanted his readers to digest, to be able to learn out of his work, is the importance of prudence. For his leadership, prudential leadership is the precondition for success. And this gets us to a more interesting question. What is prudence? For Thucydides, the prudential leaders like Themistocles, Pericles, Archidamus, Hermocrates had three basic characteristics. One, they were rational in their behavior. And rationality means that they will have a good understanding of the strategic situation. In order to make strategies, they will develop all the options. They will discuss these options. Even in oligarchic Sparta, the options were discussed. And based on this kind of rational analysis, they will make decisions. That's the first thing, rationality. The enemy of rationality is emotion. The Greek poets have shown how emotions, either over ambition or revenge or whatever, can really inflict upon rationality. And the case of Sicily and the failure of Sicily, it was a case of emotional decision-making. And the third element is foresight, to be able to see the future and prepare your country for that purpose. So if we take the concept of prudence and to apply it in the current Sino-American competition, I will say that Thucydides would have been a restrainer, would have asked both countries to avoid provocation and try to manage relations with non-emotional way. And by the way, one source of emotion is populism that comes from the people. So he would have argued that try to behave according with your interests, don't behave based on populism, and most importantly, don't provoke the other, because you get into a chain reaction that leads to escalation.
So be rational, avoid emotional emotion in strategizing, and the third, if you do this, you're acting with restraint when it comes to the competitor. Very good. Okay, Andrew.
So, thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I have to give the disclaimer that I don't speak for the Department of Defense or the National Defense University or the United States government, which is a dicey business, although since we're talking about 2,500 years ago, maybe we'll be a little bit better. But since I know you teach in China, you can look at Thucydides' leadership a little bit in the context of Sun Tzu's famous phrase about knowing yourself and knowing the enemy, if you want to be successful. Because I think that there's a lot in Thucydides which highlights the importance of that. And his leaders, the good leaders that he shows, definitely articulate both an accurate assessment of their strengths and weaknesses, and the strengths and weaknesses of their societies, but also an accurate assessment of the other side, of their rival. So, for example, Professor Platias mentioned the Spartan king Archidamus. He has a speech before the start of the war where he identifies several key aspects of Athenian power and how they relate to Sparta. And his diagnosis of those strengths and weaknesses are pretty accurate. You know, he highlights Athens has a navy, so if we want to defeat them at sea, we're going to need to get a lot of help. Athens is fabulously rich, and we're not. So we're going to have to do something about that. He talks about their strong allies. He talks about some of their weaknesses, like their need to import food. So there's this very clear articulation in the minds of leaders. Where are we strong? Where are we weak? And what does the other side look like? There's also a strong thread in his work, even though he's writing about war, where he's focused on how states can avoid war. And I think that goes to Professor Platias' point about prudence, because he wants leaders to be measured in their approach, because he wants them to be aware of how dangerous and unpredictable war is. And the good leaders in Thucydides are very open with the fact that war is inherently unpredictable. And returning to your earlier point, you mentioned that, in a nuclear age, hot war is suicidal. We also see in Thucydides how effective leaders employ creative application of both diplomacy and force to improve their position. And so I can give you 3 quick examples of that. So first is in the run-up to the war, Athens implements the famous Megarian decree. Right? This is a ban on trade of the Spartan ally of Megara within the Athenian Empire. And this is economic sanctions as a way to try and bring about some sort of compromise without the use of military force.
And trade war in general.
It's a trade war. It's a trade war. It's an aspect of a trade war. You also have, before the war, the Athenian siege of the city of Platias, which is in a curious legal status, but it's on the other side, let's say. And Sparta's ally, Corinth, has a big interest in this city. But when Athens lays siege to it, the Corinthians don't say, let's go out and defend Platias. Individual Corinthian citizens volunteer to go and fight in Platias without the sanction of the Corinthian state. These are little green men 2,500 years ago. And it gives Corinth plausible deniability, and it tries to mitigate the risk of escalation. And last, when Athens and Sparta are in this period of peace known as the Peace of Nicias, the Athenian politician Alcibiades manufactures an alliance with Sparta's great Peloponnesian rival, Argos, in an attempt to completely reorder the politics of the Peloponnese and Sparta's alliances without war. And so in Thucydides, we see economic statecraft through sanctions and trade war. We see concealed military force with plausible state deniability. We see attempts to reconfigure alliances as tools of statecraft. And so skilled leaders have to be able to operate in such a complex environment. And that's the kind of leadership I think Thucydides endorses.
If I'm allowed to supplement this analysis, it's not only Archidamus that he used SWOT analysis. Let's use a modern term when you make business decisions, strength, weakness, opportunity, threats. It's precisely this concept of rationality was in the speeches of Pericles. So the rational leaders, they will use this framework. So it was not only Archidamus, but it was also all the leaders that he considered magnificent, including Pericles, but also including Hermocrates, which, by the way, is the real leader of the war, because it was the Sicilians that they managed to defeat the Athenians and bring down the Athenian Empire.
Right, and then the concept of overextension, imperial overextension, became a classic in strategic studies.
Now, before you continue on your point of attrition, Thucydides said that the Spartans managed to win because their society and their political system could withstand the pressures of the long war. So in the case of the Cold War I, it was the United States that it had a political system that could withstand all this competition for decades, compared with a more fragile system, which was the Soviet. And the question now, which actually asked in a previous panel, is which of the two systems, the American and the Chinese, are more resilient in this kind of intensive strategic competition that's taking place.
But within that system, it was the leaders that really drove outcomes. So when Athens was governed by Pericles, the first citizen, Thucydides declared that Athens was in name a democracy, whereas in reality it was a polity, a politia, governed by the great leader Pericles. It was only when populism became dominant through Alcibiades that the ship of state crashed, right?
But don't get him wrong, it was still democracy, right?
It was a democracy, but the same democracy functioned very well when the leader was Pericles, and it was dysfunctional and crashed when the leader was Alcibiades. And the idea here is that the ship of state is the only ship that leaks from the top. Right?
But democracy can be very effective and can win wars. That's what I'm trying to say.
All right, perfect. So my second question has to do with historical analogies. You know, the dominant mental methodology of policymakers really is historical analogizing. And here we are today talking about the Peloponnesian War. In your previous panel, people talked about the Cold War, right? So we're taking those two historical cases and try to apply them on China-US relations. But neither in the Peloponnesian War nor in the Cold War, the two hegemonic rivals had any level of economic entanglement. Now we have China and the United States that they're so much economically entangled between them and also with the rest of the world. And so my question is, how could geopolitics affect this process of economic interdependence and globalization and frictionless market signals that have been going on in the past 30, 40, 50 years? And also, how could small states optimize their economic welfare in such a geopolitical environment when China and the United States are really trying to undermine the economic welfare of each other and try to decouple?
Well, I will not buy your argument that economic warfare and economic considerations did not play a role in the ancient world. After all, Andrew mentioned the Megarian degree and the trade war between Athens and it not only against Megara, by the way, against Aegina, against Spartan allies. So trade wars are always there. So what we see today, it's not modern. Also, supply chains were very important. From where the Athenians were getting their food, or from Ukraine, from the Black Sea, or from Egypt, was very important to control supply lines. So it's nothing new. Also, geopolitics and business was always related. I mean, as I mentioned, Themistocles, by having a naval program, created a whole infrastructure of shipbuilding in order to deal with the Persians. Then he wanted to deal with the Spartans. He built walls. All the builders, the construction business in Athens was using that geopolitical thing for its advantage. The same thing today. I mean, when you have sanctions, let's take energy sanctions against Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. This completely upends the energy market. The war in Ukraine, for example, it leads to a global rebalancing. Or geopolitical projects like the BRI. It's essentially infrastructure. So also what's going on in maritime trade, for example. If the Houthis decide to close the Black Sea, or the Russians decide to, the Red Sea, or the Russians and the Ukrainians fight in the Black Sea, again, it influences markets. So everything in business is related to geopolitics. So my advice is, and I think it comes from Thucydides, in order to understand how the process takes place in an international system, including business process, you have to understand the big picture, which is geopolitics. That's where you start.
All right, Andrew.
So there's the old expression, money makes the world go round. But in the geopolitical context, it sometimes seems that countries are willing to accept a lot of economic pain in order to assure their security. And so to sort of connect the two parts of your question, the analogy there would be the First World War, where the European countries were so economically interconnected that some people even wrote books, Norman Engel's famous book, The Great Illusion, that war is impossible because it's going to bankrupt everyone. And Engel was 50% right. It did bankrupt everyone, but it wasn't impossible. And so we have to deal with that reality. I mean, you have another analogy from the period before and during the Second World War when countries instead tried autarky. They thought that the way to insulate themselves from geopolitical risk autarkic, completely self-sufficient. And sometimes that meant you had to build an empire in order to be self-sufficient. This may be the case with Athens. We can maybe discuss if we have time, if that's an accurate parallel. How do small powers react? It's difficult because the pressures from the major hegemonic contestants create a lot of challenges and difficulties for the small powers, but it also creates opportunities. One thing you see in Thucydides, if you go through the whole book, there's a lot of fluidity in alliances. States think about ways that they can maybe change sides or go from one camp to the other, and they can also try to play the two big sides off against each other to get concessions. This is a potential strategy that can have some payoffs. It's also a risky one because in Thucydides and in other examples, you also see that states that try to change sides or change alliances, they often come back to their original alliance because it's based on substantive shared interests.
Or they bring them back by force.
Or they bring them back by force. And those substantive interests are not so easy to break. I mean, sometimes they're things like geography, complete economic integration, supplies of food or raw materials, and so it's much harder to change. And so small states really have a difficult situation where there's a potentially high payoff, but there's also a risk of being brought back, as Professor Platias was saying, while at the same time the reality that you may think you have more flexibility than you do, but your long-term interests mean that you're kind of in one camp or the other, until those camps change their attitude dramatically.
All right, a follow-up on this, because I think it's important for Greece. A core concept in Thucydides is the concept of thalassokratia, of thalassocracy, sea power. And Athens was the uncontested thalassocrat in the Aegean, in the East Med. Today, there's a lot of discussion in Washington about ships being the new chips. So we have significant competition when it comes to microchips. Now we're having significant competition when it comes to ships. And Greeks control about 21% of global shipping. That means it's capital that flows mostly to Chinese shipyards. You mentioned allies. Greece is an ally of the United States. We have a security treaty, but we also have a very good relationship with China. We're great civilizations. We consider the Chinese as a great contributor to world peace. How can Greece manage this very sensitive situation right now with the US trying to contain the maritime power of China and Greece being one of the leaders in providing capital to Chinese shipyards?
Well, the new Cold War takes place at sea, not in land like the first Cold War. And the Americans and the Chinese are fighting into that. The Chinese have an advantage, which is their shipbuilding capacity, which is actually, in the long term, it allows them to compete with the United States, that even outcompete with them. Now, because the United States does not have this great shipbuilding capacity and it has to concentrate mostly on warships and ignores the other part, it needs its allies. Therefore, countries like Greece, that control 20% of the world maritime fleet and 60% of the European, are extremely important for the Americans in order to do strategic mobility in time of crisis and war. But now the Americans are getting into a kind of antithesis or contradiction in their strategies. They try to impose fees on the Greek ship owners if they build ships in Chinese shipyards. But these very ships are very useful for the Americans in case of crisis and war. So part of their strategy on shipbuilding has a problem, and I think they will find it out and they will readjust it.
Right.
But at the moment, thalassocracy is very important for China and the United States. That's why the United States is trying to impose cost on Chinese shipbuilding and try to create at the same time incentives that production will move in the United States.
All right, Andrew, 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Yeah.
Small question. I think we can also look at the foundations of what the ships are for, right? In the sense that for Athens, in the context of their time, their ships meant trade, their ships meant food, their ships meant their ability to adequately manage their empire, right? Without the ships, you can't keep the islands in your empire by coercion, you can't get food to supply your city, and you can't bring in the trade that makes you rich, and your whole empire is based on financial strength. What are those pillars today for China or the United States? Why do we need ships? Why do the Chinese need ships? They need them for trade, of course, and this is kind of a dangerous topic right now in terms of trade, because it's one of the most contentious ones. And unfortunately, there's an attitude that, in a way, we're moving back to the idea I mentioned at the beginning, in the sort of the pre-Second World War mindset of autarky, which makes trade less of a priority, and that could be quite dangerous.
All right, my goodness, I think one thing is clear, that after 2,500 years, Thucydides remains relevant. He indeed wrote a possession for all times, and we talk about democratia, we talk about thalassocratia, and these are debates that we're going to continue to have fervently. Gentlemen, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you all for being with us.